Not too long ago, I posed some questions to an Italian professor by the name of Tommaso Beggio. Tommaso Beggio was giving a lecture at the University of Belgrade on the death penalty in the Roman Empire. This was the subject that he was talking about. And so I listened to some of the lecture, and I listened to some of the questions, because I was listening to the lecture online, and they have this little function where you can hit a button that looks like a hand, and it means that you're raising your hand because you want to ask a question. So my little hand was raised on my screen. It's kind of funny. And as I was waiting for my hand to be called, I was listening to the questions that were being presented. And I will be honest, these questions were just stupid, meaningless, and to be honest, and to be kind of vulgar, they were verbal masturbation. Like, oh, what do you think of this little thing that happened in the context of this, and yada, yada, yada. And then more verbal masturbation is articulated by the professor, and he's talking about, in the context of the Roman Empire and within the antiquity, the law was this. And I heard that there was this one German guy who was asking a question, and I'm not sure if I think he is a professor, I'm not sure, but he was asking this question about prison infrastructure, and he's like, do you think, I'm trying to do the German accent, do you think that that there was a serious prison infrastructure? Because you have this very large empire, and in order to put prisoners to confine criminals, you would need a major prison infrastructure. Yeah, so could you tell us about the prison infrastructure? And I'm thinking to myself, did anyone not know that they had infrastructure in the Roman Empire? They built roads that are still lasting today. They built architecture that people can still see today. And this guy's asking about, did the Roman Empire have sufficient prison infrastructure? And I'm sitting there thinking, they put people in salt mines. I watched the movie Barabbas with Anthony Quinn. They put people in salt mines. That's how they put people in prison in the Roman Empire. Yes, they had prisons, but they also put a lot of people in mines. And they just put you in a mine, and you worked yourself to death. I watched Barabbas, and if you have not seen the film Barabbas, starring Anthony Quinn, I highly, highly recommend that you watch that movie. It is a cinematic masterpiece. Truly it is. And what does the professor say? He says, well, they would put people in salt mines. I'm thinking, I watched the movie Barabbas. I don't need to be a professor to know that. So I'm hearing all these, and then of course he said, they did indeed have a prison infrastructure, and I'm like, of course they did. They were a major civilization. Of course they had prison infrastructure. So they'll sit there and I hate to use this word, but these professors will sit there and verbally masturbate for hours and hours. And the problem with this is that there is no practical application. The problem with a lot of academia is that they talk a lot about history without any sort of practical application. How does this apply to society? How does this help society? How does this contribute to society? How would this knowledge be of a benefit to society? You see, I read Josephus's history on the Roman-Jewish War. Why? Because I want to have a deeper understanding of Israel. Because the past reflects the present. And the things that take place in the past lead to what we deal with in the present. It's like you can't talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war without talking about the OUN and Stepan Bandera or the Soviet Union. Why? Because the past reflects the present. So I want practical application, so I'm looking at this professor, Tommaso Beggio, and he's talking about Roman Empire and the death penalty and the death penalty in the ancient world. And I ask him a very logical question. I say, what to you are the best arguments for reinstating the death penalty in Europe? He says they are none. They are none. So he says that there are no good arguments. So I press him further, and I say, well, what if somebody wants to commit a murder, but then they think, well, if I get caught and I'm found guilty, I'm going to be put to death, so I best not do that, and it discourages the person from committing the crime. He says, well, I don't believe that that's really the case. And I said, okay, and I press him further. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. Well, first I said, let's look at the United States. In the United States, we have the death penalty in a very, very limited way. And the death penalty is not really just limited to certain states. If you really want to get into the weeds of it, the death penalty is truly limited to certain counties in the United States. And a lot of the executions that are done in America are done within particular counties. So counties in Texas, counties in Oklahoma, etc. And we only execute in this country like a dozen or so people a year. And we have a very high murder rate. So we really don't have the death penalty in its totality in this country. We don't. I said, but if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, where they have a very, very strong death penalty policy, the murder rate in Saudi Arabia is literally less than one. It's literally less than one per every 100,000 people in the Saudi population. So there's less than one murders per every 100,000. Whereas in the United States, you have a murder rate of, it can vary between 5 people per 100,000, 7 people per 100,000. For example, in the year 2020, we had a huge increase in murders in the United States. We had about 22,000 or so murders in the year 2020 in the United States. And I said that the Saudi murder rate is much lower than that of the U.S. and the European Union. So there is something to be said about a society that has a very, very strong death penalty policy. And he said, yeah, I don't really care. I don't agree with the death penalty. So I pressed him further. And I said, well, and I gave him a very gruesome example. Let's look at one example in the United States of someone who is worthy of capital punishment. Let's look at Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader murdered the Otero family, went into the house and slaughtered the family. One of the sons was coming home from school. He walks into his house only to see his father dead, his mother dead, his sister dead, and his brother dead. Not only that, Dennis Rader slaughtered the family, and he violated the corpse of the little girl in the family. And I asked Tommaso Beggio, is Dennis Rader worthy of the death penalty? And he said no. Okay. I decided to just end the discussion at that point. And he did not look comfortable. And the faculty that was watching, they weren't very comfortable. Why? Because I was asking questions that had practical application in light of the subject of Mr. Beggio. What is the point of talking? And people will say, well, Ted, you were asking questions about the death penalty in the modern world. He was talking about the death penalty in the ancient world. So you were bringing up something that did not have a connection with what he was discussing. And I would say that that's a bunch of horse crap. Because when you're talking about Roman civilization, what is the point of talking about Roman civilization unless you have an application to something today? What is the point? Because if you just want to talk about the ancient world for the sake of talking about the ancient world, at this point it's just drivel. Who cares? But let's talk about the ancient world in light of the current world. Now we can learn something from the past. Now we can apply something from the past to today. Now we can learn from the mistakes of the past. Or we can learn the wisdom of the past, and we can apply it today, and we can better ourselves as a society. But if you just want to talk about the ancient world or any sort of historical era for the sake of talking about an historical era, then it's just verbal masturbation at this point. You're just intellectually masturbating yourself and posing yourself and saying, oh, look how smart I am. I know so much about the past. But who really cares about the past unless there's something from the past that we can learn from, that can benefit us, that we can take and we can apply to our own world, and we can better our condition and better our minds, and we can edify ourselves. You see, there's this common trope that says those who fail to read history are doomed to repeat it, or those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. There are plenty of people who read history. Walk into any bookstore, Barnes & Noble, etc. You'll find plenty of books on history. American Revolution, World War II, World War I, the Pacific War, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. You'll find books on all sorts of stuff. The Apaches, ancient Egyptians, the pyramids. You'll find all sorts of books. Well, if no one's reading history, then these books wouldn't exist. There's obviously a market for history. But how come we're not learning from history? The reason why we're not learning from history is because we believe in the paradigm of the academics. We believe in the mentality of the academics, which says, let's just read history for the sake of history. It's for my own personal interest. I've never had that position. Never. To me, knowledge is like water in a pot, and once it begins to boil, it eventually boils over. Knowledge should not be contained within your mind. It should not be confined within your mind. It should boil over outside of yourself to edify others. They say that those who do not read history are doomed to repeat it. I say that the greatest lesson from history is that people do not learn from history, because they believe in this drivel of the academics, and they fall into this mentality that is conditioned by the academics. And it basically says, well, you're asking these very intense questions, or these questions that pertain to a controversial subject. I don't want to get into that. I just want to talk about history. Well, here's the problem. There lies the problem. Because you have no practical application. And when you hear someone talking about something like, the death penalty of the ancient world, well, let's talk about the application. Or here's another example. Polish people love talking about the atrocities that the Ukrainians did to them in the 1940s. Well, Polish people will also attack you for saying, not all Polish people, but they are Polish people who will attack you for saying, hey, Poland getting a little too close to these Ukrainian nationalists. Don't you learn from history? And isn't it interesting that for decades, the Ukrainian government denied the Volyn massacre, denied what the OUN did in East Galicia, denied what the Ukrainian nationalists did to the Polish people in Lvov? But then once Russia invaded Ukraine, all of a sudden, the Ukrainian government comes along and says, oh, no. The Volyn massacre happened. They admitted to the massacre only when Russia invaded them. Because it was purely for political reasons. It was advantageous for them at that point to do so. But for so many decades, they denied it. For so many decades, they would get angry. For years, they would get angry anytime Poland would bring up Volyn. There was a Polish director who made a film about the Volyn massacre. Ukraine banned it. They said, no, this film's not going to be played here. the Polish government tried to have a presentation at I think it was at the Polish embassy in Ukraine. They canceled it. They didn't want it to happen. Polish people love talking about what happened in Volyn, in East Galicia, in Lvov, but a lot of them don't want to apply that historical knowledge to today, which is so damn sad and depressing, because it's like, you're talking about this massacre. Oh my God, you have literally Ukrainian soldiers walking around with Nazi insignias. They're walking around with SS paraphernalia. They're praising they're praising the people who murdered your people. They're praising Bandera. They're praising Andrei Melnik. They're praising these people. They have built monuments to these people. They've dedicated infrastructure to these people. But the history doesn't apply. See, this is the most dangerous thing about reading history for the sake of reading history. This is why it's stupid. I would never read history for the sake of reading history. Never. I would never read history for the sake of reading history. When I read history, I'm always looking for applications to today. For example, I've been talking about the potential for a civil war in Israel. Well, Ted, why are you talking about the possibility of a civil war in Israel? Because I read Josephus. He talks about a civil war between the Hebrews in the midst of their war with the Romans. It could happen again. If I read about the American Civil War, I would only do so in light of the fact that America could be facing another civil war. I'm reading about Serbia. Why? Because there's still turbulency in the Balkans. I'm reading about the Ottoman Empire. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire wants to revive. I'm reading about the Armenian genocide. Why? Because the Turks want to resume from where they left off. I'm reading about Japanese nationalism. Why? Because the Japanese still deny Nanking. And they still have hardcore nationalism in their government and in their society. And it's very dangerous. And they're rising militarily. I'm still talking about Nazism. Why? Because the Germans are reviving. That's why. That is the reason why. And when you see, remember years ago when Trump was president, he wanted to remove the American troops from Germany. And I was thinking, this is a terrible idea. Once you remove the U.S. troops, that gives the green light to the Germans to say, oh, we can now revive our military because America is not dependable anymore. It's not reliable anymore. And even Trump, when he left the presidency, when he was no longer the president, even Trump admitted that it was a problem. That Germany reviving its military strength is a problem. That Japan reviving its military strength is a problem. He admitted it, even though he contributed to the problem to a certain extent. There is no point in reading history for the sake of reading history. It is complete stupidity, in my opinion. Now, I shouldn't say complete stupidity because people have a hobby and they're like, okay, fine, good for you. But to me, the important thing of reading history is real-life application. Without real-life application, it's just drivel. It's just a hobby. When I read Julius Caesar's account of the conquest of Gaul, what was I learning in that history? I wasn't just learning that, and so many people like focusing on battles for some reason. I go, battle tactics and strategy. Tactics don't really change. I remember I interviewed a Serbian sniper who's been fighting in Ukraine since 2014, Dejan Beric. And I asked him about battles and all this stuff. And he said, battles are battles. They don't change. That's it. Tactics are tactics. Tactics are tactics. People will lead the enemy into a trap and then ambush them. An army will pretend to be scared and run away, and then they'll lead their enemy to a trap. One army will flank another enemy. I mean, people have been doing this since forever, and we see Russia doing it right now in Bakhmut. I mean, the whole thing about Bakhmut is not as strategically important as other parts of Ukraine, but nonetheless, the Russians are using it to lead the Ukrainians into a blender. And that's what's happening. Right now, the Russians are draining Ukraine of manpower and of weaponry. That's what's happening. Well, we can see people doing that in ancient times. So to me, it's like battle tactics or battle tactics. But you can look at Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul and you can see, wow, the French and the Germans are at war. And then you see the Gauls. I mean, the French are the modern day Gauls to a certain extent. The Gauls, you see the Gauls literally being ruled by the Germanic tribes. What do you see today? France is still a puppet of Germany. I mean, France is still a servant of Germany. The Germans invaded France numerous times, World War I, World War II. History hasn't changed. But you can read Julius Caesar and you can find real life application. You can read Josephus and you can find real life application. You can read Thucydides, you can read Thucydides' account of his Peloponnesian War and you can find real life application. This is the point of history. The point of history is to take knowledge from it and apply it to today. This is why history is so important. But what we actually learn from history, for the most part, is that people don't learn from history. Bottom line. Anyway, that's my talk for tonight. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.
Хотів твої долоні на танець повільний. Я знову запізнився, я знову запізнився. Музика лиш грає в фоні, в мені ритм винний. Я знову напився, я знову напився. Танцями я знову п'яний, сонцем млявий день мерзотний, десь рай між зоряний, а в нім сидить і він самотній. Танцями я знову п'яний, сонцем млявий день мерзотний, десь рай між зоряний, а в нім сидить і він самотній. Хотів твої долоні на танець повільний. Я знову запізнився, я знову запізнився.